Welcome to the latest Watercolors Aquarium Gallery video brought to you from the Aquarium Rush Studios in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're going to talk today about fertilizers in aquarium plants, and specifically all-in-one fertilizers versus I'm going to dose a little of this and dose a little of that and dose a little of this, and what is the best way to go?
Yeah, those all-in-ones have really gained a lot of popularity lately, and I get it. It's just you pump in the amount you're supposed to, and that's all you have to do. I've always been a little bit suspicious of them.
Yes. What about different water parameters? I
Yeah.
know West Michigan Grand Rapids City tap water has a much different water profile than water from a well 100 miles north of here, or from, say, the water in Atlanta, Georgia, or Seattle.
Yeah, it's a great point. And my question always has been, could it really be that easy?
Right.
Yeah. I think what it comes down to is you really need to factor in what your source water is or what your maintenance schedule is. Because I'll admit, I went into this with kind of a bias where I was like, some of these aren't going to do very well and some of these are going to do better.
Yeah.
And I came out of it respecting each individual product because having worked with it and tested with it, I was like, these are very clearly designed for specific things. And these are all really good at doing that.
Excellent. All right, so talk about the parameters of your experiment.
Okay. So I had ideal ranges that I was trying to shoot for. I wanted ammonia, which is the NH3, at 0.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the nitrate, which is this NO3, to be present but low.
Okay.
And then I wanted the phosphate, which is this PO4. These are like chemical formula designations, by the way. I wanted it to be present but below 1 milligram per liter, whatever you want to call that.
Right.
And then the ideal range that I could find for potassium was like 15 to like 30 parts per million.
That's a pretty big range.
Yeah. But the idea was, so how do I best achieve that? So we use tap water here.
Yeah.
So then the first step is, what's in our tap water?
Okay.
And I'm going to have to look because there are a lot of numbers here. So we typically have no ammonia in our tap water.
Mm-hmm.
Except once in a while, we do have a little influx of it in.
Really?
Yeah. I had 2 tests that had ammonia at, I think it was 0.5 milligrams per liter.
That's actually pretty high ammonia.
That's pretty high.
Wow.
And I was like, okay.
That's really weird.
Yeah.
This is the part where things get really interesting, and this is the part that I knew was going to throw a wrench into all-in-ones. Our phosphate coming out of the tap was consistently, during the entire time I was doing this, 2.0 milligrams per liter.
And what was your target?
Below 1.
Below 1.
Wow.
So basically what you're saying there is, if you have Grand Rapids City tap water, you really don't need to add any phosphate
No.
to a plant aquarium. Okay.
Our tap water's potassium is at like 10 to 15 parts per million. I was surprised it was that high at all. I expected it to be about 5.
Mm-hmm.
Just because with calcium carbonate being as plentiful in our water, I just expected that it would kind of like push it out.
Sure.
Guess not. So why these parameters? Ammonia, because it's stupidly toxic to living things.
Right.
The goal should always be to have it at 0, at max 0.25 milligrams per liter. There's a very specific reason for that, and that's because that is the threshold of most organisms can still survive that.
Mm-hmm.
As you get higher, it starts plateauing. A higher percentage of organisms of any given species will start to succumb to ammonia poisoning.
So 0.5 ammonia, 0.5 parts per million ammonia,
Yeah.
added in the tap water
Is not insignificant, but the good thing about this is that we have well-stocked planted tanks
right?
and large tanks.
Right.
So that means that this was being diluted into a system
Sure.
and then very quickly being converted into something else.
Okay.
So then nitrate, because that is one of the more common ways that, it's not the way that plants most readily absorb nitrogen, but in our planted aquariums, it's the easiest way for us to provide nitrogen to them. So low but present. And then phosphate is a really big deal. This was the one that I was anxious to do a lot of testing with. A, because I made my ideals without knowing what our tap water was.
Okay.
B, and I actually have evidence to prove that's exactly what happened here.
Cool.
So this is really oversimplifying the biology, but chemical reactions happen in proportions.
Mm-hmm.
So most biological processes that plants use to be a plant requires nitrogen and phosphate to be at about a 10-to-1 ratio.
10 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphate.
Yes.
Okay.
Give or take.
Yep.
That was going to be the tricky part here because we were
Right.
already starting at a really high phosphate.
Right.
And that's the one that you need less of.
I'm starting to see the issue with an all-in-one fertilizer.
Yeah. So, for these 2 columns right here, I did a slightly different way of testing than I did with the rest of the way.
Okay.
Because you guys changed the rules on me.
No, we're allowed to do that. It's our game.
But, so the original plan was for me to do 3 weeks of ADA in the Glosso tank.
Okay.
And then 3 weeks of, well, I did 3 weeks of Seachem and then 3 weeks of ADA.
Cool.
And then I was tracking dosing and stuff like that throughout those weeks and monitoring what the parameters were at any given time.
Okay.
I think I tested them like 3 or 4 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what I was dosing, I was dosing the recommended dose on the bottle.
Right.
Except for, there were a few exceptions here.
Okay.
So the ADA is designed to work differently than all the other things tested here. It needs to be dosed daily, or it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only here 5 days a week. So I feel the need to point out that I was already suboptimally dosing ADA.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I wasn't trying to dose nitrogen, both of those are basically at 0 for both of these ones.
Okay.
But the plants were growing well, so the goal originally was I was trying to find a way to dose nitrogen by feeding my fish.
Right.
And it seemed to be working until we kept selling our Kubota reservoirs.
Funny how these experiments tend to do that.
Yep.
Can't just have a simple control.
The phosphate was low but present in both cases.
Okay.
In the ADA one, it was very notable because we did not have any algal growth,
True.
but really good glosso growth.
Their Glosso was doing amazing.
And then the potassium for Seachem was a little bit suboptimal.
Okay.
Not in a, I think it scored terribly. It was just when I first dosed it,
Mm-hmm.
it would be at 15 parts per million. So
Okay.
it was at the range I needed it to be.
Right.
But the day before my next dose, it would be down to 10 parts per million.
Okay. So it was definitely getting used up.
It was
used up
getting
a little
used.
quicker than you wanted it to.
Whereas the ADA stayed, because I was dosing it basically every day, it was
Yeah.
staying at 15 to 20 parts per million.
Okay.
So I'd give it pretty good props for that.
Yep.
Now, this is where the wrench got thrown in my system.
Again.
Then after I had finished testing these 2, Ben and Amy said, "So what if we got you to test some all-in-ones?" And I said, "Okay, well now I'm dosing something that has nitrogen, so
Yeah.
the comparison between these and these, I'm not sure is exactly fair.
Okay.
But the results for what happened here still speak for what happened with these things.
Yeah.
So I want to be very clear on, I don't think you should compare these to these. I think you should just see what happened in the parameters.
I like it.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we got the Aquarium Co-Op Easy Green,
Mm-hmm.
and it said low to moderate light. So then I started including the Crinum tank in this.
Excellent.
Because the Glosso tank is very clearly a highlight tank.
Yes.
That is a pretty fast-growing, pretty high-tech system.
Yep.
The other factor for that tank that I think we need to mention when we're talking about this and talking about how it still grew when we couldn't measure nitrates in the water is it has a really rich soil substrate. So that's probably where those plants were getting most of that, I would think, at that
I would
point.
hope so.
Otherwise, I don't know where they were getting it from.
That's probably, yeah.
So,
So this tank was included because I think it more melds with what that product was trying to be used for.
Okay.
And I think that's more fair to this product. Potassium slowly dropped in both tanks during dosing.
Okay.
The plants were very clearly using it, and they were using it very fast. And I think that's because, so I mentioned that I wasn't dosing nitrogen.
Yes.
I think there was a sudden influx of nitrogen.
Oh,
and they thought,
Yeah.
we can do something
We can
with
grow
it.
like crazy.
And then they suddenly hit a wall of, wait, we're out of potassium.
wow.
That still leaves something really interesting. So these are the two Easy Green ones. We started getting some algae growth in both of these tanks, but not enough for me to be like, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, this left column is high-tech system and the right column is low-tech system, right?
Yes, so this is, the C is the crinum tank,
Okay.
just behind us.
Yep.
And then the G is the
The
glosso
glosso
tank.
So
Okay.
highlight CO2, medium light, no CO2.
Yep.
Both of those systems are going to use nutrients at a much different rate.
Yes. The first fun thing is that we finally had nitrate actually present in both systems.
Yay!
Funnily enough, dosing it makes it stick around.
All right.
Each dosing period was only 3 weeks though, and I
Okay.
feel the need to comment that in the glosso tank, it was like clearly there was an influx of nitrate and then it would slowly work its way down. This tank was not eating its way through before each dose, so it was slowly accumulating.
Okay.
I'm sure there's an equilibrium point at
Mhm.
some point, but I did not reach it.
Right. And was that with one type of fertilizer, or with whatever fertilizer you were using, there was an accumulation of nitrogen?
Let's just say that for the Easy Green,
Yes.
I did not get an accumulation of nitrate in the glosso.
Okay.
I did start to get it in here, but I think that's just because I didn't reach the equilibrium point, whatever that was, in the 3 weeks that I did it.
Sure.
That was interesting because then we started seeing a increase in phosphate. So it turns out that dosing phosphate in a system that already has too much phosphate.
I could see how that could be a problem. So, what was the effect of having too much phosphate in the system, Charles?
Algae.
Was that the green water we were looking at for a few days?
No, that was the NILOCG.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to preface this by saying, having used this product, I think it's an amazing product. It does not pair well with our water here.
Right on.
Because this is a product that's very clearly designed to replace nutrients in a soft water, tap water environment when you're doing a lot of water changes.
Okay.
We are not really either of those.
Right.
So you would see a big bump in nitrate. So this one, and everyone's going to go, why is the number the exact same for both systems? Because it's dosed per the gallonage. So theoretically, it should be hitting the same.
Right.
That's the part where I'm like, this is a well-made product because each time I dosed it, it hit exactly 4 milligrams per liter
That's
nitrate.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
Every single time.
So that means they were well tested if they can produce consistent results.
Yeah, that's spectacular.
Yeah.
The phosphate is where I ran into trouble. And
Right.
this is where we got the green water. Because it would have that massive influx of phosphate in a system that theoretically already had it
Right.
every time we were doing a water change.
That would throw that 10-to-1 ratio way off.
Yeah, so that's when the glosso tank had green water.
That was when we started to lose faith with your experiment a little bit.
Yeah.
But it was very distinct green water. It was a little spooky.
Right.
Yeah, but this was the part where I'm like, I have data to prove that this stuff happens proportionally.
Okay.
So, when the green water happened in that system,
Yeah.
the nitrate all of a sudden dropped to 0 and stayed there.
So
Wow.
the algae was just sucking up all of the nitrate.
Yep. But it couldn't use up all the phosphate.
Uh-huh. The balance was off.
Because the balance was
It's
off.
all about balance.
And so I thought that was so cool to be
Yeah.
able to be like,
Yeah.
oh, that makes a lot of sense. Of
Yeah.
course, it can't use all of it.
Right.
We like when things make sense.
Yes.
The potassium scored a little bit better in both systems. It was like 10 to 15.
Okay.
Every time I dosed it, it would jump up to 15 parts per million.
Makes sense.
And then by the time I needed to dose next, it would be down to 10.
Yep.
And so I was like, all right, so this product is really good if you're doing like weekly water changes and you have tap water that's soft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not
what we have
that's
here.
not what we have here. So
The big takeaway from this experiment to me is first, know your local water, or talk to somebody who does.
Mm-hmm.
And second, know what you're dosing and why.
yeah, and I think that's valid. I tell people all the time that come into the store, they say, I have no idea what my tap water is. And my response is, bring it in, I'll test it.
Yeah.
Because at least knowing what your like starting off point is really useful, because as this shows, you are not starting at 0.
Right. Yeah. So another takeaway from me is that if you're doing a low-tech tank and you want to make sure there's some extra nutrients in there, be a little cautious, but that's where an all-in-one fertilizer can be useful.
Yeah, it can be really useful.
Be aware of the value a little bit and pay attention to your tank.
Yeah.
If you're going high-tech, you got to be all in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where knowing your individual parameters are going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, I'll comment and say the Glosso tank is back on ADA,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
the Crittern tank is back on Seachem.
Makes
Because
sense.
That's what works for us.
that's what works
Yeah.
for the tanks that we want to maintain and how we want to maintain
Right.
them.
Right.
And don't be scared of these fertilizers just because you need to dose specific things. Once you settle in on that balance, then you have your routine, and it should be pretty standard.
Yeah.
So it's just about a little bit of experimentation, and usually the stakes are your plants are growing a little slower or you're getting a little more algae. So don't be
Right.
afraid to figure out what fertilizers work best for your water and work best for your level of maintenance.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I guess I didn't really consider when I was drafting this up, is that your system itself is unique, not just because of the water you're using, but also what you have in it, how much you're feeding, what kind of plants you have in
different
there.
substrate, all
Yeah.
of those things.
Those are all factors. And
Someone who does a monthly water change might need that extra nitrate and phosphate to feed their plants if they have a densely planted system and not that many fish. It just depends on you.
And I think I can imagine someone watching this and hear us talk about all these factors, and they're like, "Oh, that's so intimidating."
So many numbers.
Yeah.
It's really not. From the standpoint of you only have to address them one at a time,
Yep.
and you can address them incrementally
Mm-hmm.
Right.
or when you feel like. If you feel like you want to do a low-tech planet tank and you just kind of want to start dosing a little bit, that's really easy to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And if you decide, I want a little bit faster plant growth and I'd like to be able to do this moderate care plant, that's a really easy adjustment to like shift gears
Sure.
into.
Yeah.
That's one thing about planet tanks that like shifting gears with fish is really hard,
Yeah.
Right. Right.
because what works for one fish definitely does not work for most of them.
Mhm.
But with plants, it's really easy to shift gears because they're stupidly adaptable.
Yeah.
It's not at all unlike what we do in a reef system with moving from a soft coral system to a hard coral system to an SPS coral system, and the level of testing and dosing that we have to do. There are things that work in a soft coral tank that are just not enough for a hard coral tank, and I think that's a pretty good analogous situation going from a low-tech planet tank to a high-tech planet tank.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So start from a good foundation like we talked about in our substrate video,
Yeah.
but also, and that will give you a little bit more wiggle room in terms of what you can get away with, whether you're fertilizing or not and how much, and then tweak it, experiment, figure out what works.
Yeah.
And, coming down and having us double check your results
Yeah.
never hurts. We're very
We can
happy
do
to
that.
walk through those and figure out, oh, you're doing really good. And this is the one thing that, you have to do egregiously bad to fail at this. It's like,
I don't know, that green water was pretty...
yeah. But it's like,
But it's clear now.
It
it's
is.
clear now,
Clear.
and it's very manageable.
Yeah.
That was a crazy mistake that I think would unnerve a lot of new people. And if they had come in and were just like, oh, this is your solution, this is how you rectify it, like that was a week ago.
Yeah.
Less. It would have been quicker if the right UV sterilizer would have put on to rip out the
one that works,
green
you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, but it did turn the situation around very, very quickly.
And I think this is the long way of me saying, don't be afraid to ask for help, and don't be afraid to find those people who are willing to talk it out with you, whether it be an aquarium club or your local fish store.
I love these tests, Charles. And don't be afraid to tell Charles what you want him to test next.
Yeah.
I'm always curious.
These are ways for all of us to learn a little bit more about this really cool hobby that we do.
Yeah, and keep an eye on our podcast. We might go into some more in-depth discussion on these kinds of topics.
I think we're going to need to. Yeah. Thanks a lot for watching. Have lots of fun and keep those hands wet.